Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our ongoing series, The Perils Facing the African Continent. This is our 9th episode titled Africa During the Cold War Era. In this episode, we turn to an often overlooked but deeply impactful chapter of our history, that of the Cold War era, which lasted between 1947 and 1991, which translates to 44 years of grueling contestation between the East and the West. The Cold War era is globally remembered as a showdown, a period of intense confrontation between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. However, for Africa, the Cold War was one in a series of tragedies faced by the African continent. The tragedy of the Cold War, which shall be discussed in this episode, was preceded by similar tragedies covered in our earlier episodes. Specifically, the first was the violent and destructive arrival of the Europeans on the African continent. Second was the infamous transatlantic slave trade. And the third was the European colonization of Africa. Each of these episodes in our history had an enduring, devastating effect on the African continent, with the fourth tragedy, that of the Cold War, not being any better. The Cold War, mostly referred to as the East-West confrontation between the then superpowers, USA and USSR, was a global phenomenon, a complex, multidimensional showdown between the two powers and their allies that impacted on all spheres of global interaction, whether geopolitical, socio-economic, military, for control, dominance, and influence of states, regions, territories across the world. But for Africa, it was never a distant affair. As the two giants fought, it was Africa that was being trampled upon, just like the grass that suffers when two elephants fight. It was a violent storm that swept across the continent, transforming dreams of independence into battlegrounds and turning our lands into theaters of foreign rivalry. It is a story of ideology, proxy wars, economic coercion, and the unfair exploitation of our mineral wealth. To fully understand the impact of the Cold War, let us revisit the high hopes of Africa's independence era. In the 1950s, several African countries, such as Libya in 1951, Sudan, Morocco, and Tunisia in 1956, and Ghana in 1957, gained their independence from former colonial powers. These nations were among the first wave of post-World War II decolonization. It was a historic moment that sparked a tidal wave of decolonization. Specifically, the year 1960 is often called the Year of Africa because 17 nations declared independence in that year alone. Over the next 2 decades, countries from Nigeria to Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast to the Congo, gained their freedom. Namibia would follow in 1990, Eritrea in 1993, and most recently, South Sudan in 2011. There are also unique exceptions in Africa's colonial history. Liberia, founded in 1847 by freed African American slaves, was never colonized, while Ethiopia, though invaded by Mussolini's Italy in the 1930s, never fully lost its sovereignty. Both nations became symbols of African resistance and pride during their independence struggles. Africa's leaders debated their political futures, informed and shaped by pre-independence movements. In 1961, the Casablanca Group, led by Ghana, Egypt, and Algeria, called for immediate continental unity, a United States of Africa. On the other hand, was the Monrovia Group, comprising Nigeria, Liberia, and many Francophone states, which preferred gradual cooperation to achieve continental unity. Their compromise created the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, in 1963, today's African Union, that continues to champion the continental agenda. One striking feature of the independence era was the youthful nature and vision of Africa's leaders at the time. Lumumba of the Congo was just 35, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania was 39, and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia was 40. These leaders, among many others, dreamt of economic self-reliance, cultural revival, and the true sovereignty of Africa. Many, like Nkrumah of Ghana, Lumumba, were assassinated. Others were overthrown, yet their legacies endure as symbols of Pan-African resistance. In the 1950s and 60s, there were moments of deep continental solidarity. Leaders like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, then Tanganyika, offered to delay his own country's independence so that Kenya and Uganda could enjoy independence celebrations at the same time. This sense of unity showed that while the struggles were local, the vision was continental, a dream that we need to rekindle even today in Africa. Today, Africa counts 55 countries. 54 are recognized by the United Nations, but the African Union includes all the 55, standing firm in its recognition of Western Sahara. This complex map of independence laid the foundation for a new dawn of self-determination and sovereignty. But just as one battle ended, that of colonization, another one, that of the Cold War, was ongoing. As African nations celebrated their independence, the world was deeply engaged into a new kind of conflict, the Cold War, an ideological struggle between capitalism and socialism, democracy and communism that quickly extended into the developing world. Africa, with its vast mineral resources and fragile new post-colonial states, became a prize in the rivalry. As a matter of fact, the continent became a hotbed of the confrontation between the East and the West. The Cold War was rarely fought with open confrontation between Washington and Moscow. Instead, it played out in proxy wars, military coups, and economic pressures or competition. Africa, with its young and fragile, newly independent states, still struggling to stabilize, became one of the main theaters of the East-West confrontation. To expound this, let's take the Congo, present-day DRC, which got independence from Belgium in June 1960. That brought hope, but also chaos within days of its independence. Patrice Lumumba, the then young and charismatic prime minister, turned to the Soviet Union for help during a national crisis. That decision alarmed Washington and Brussels. Within a year, Lumumba was deposed, assassinated in a conspiracy that was tied to Belgian interest and the United States Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. In his place, Mobutu Sese Seko was propped up by the West, who ruled Zaire for over 3 decades as their puppet, enriching himself while impoverishing his people. This is despite the Congo being, and Congo is what we are referring to as Zaire, being one of the most mineral-rich countries in the world. Angola, which got independence from Portugal in 1975, immediately spiraled into a bloody civil war. The MPLA, backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba, faced off against UNITA and FNLA, supported by the United States and the then apartheid South Africa, among others. Cuba sent thousands of troops, not as colonizers, but as part of a revolutionary mission. Yet the conflict dragged on for 27 years, leaving more than 500,000 people dead. The Horn of Africa tells another story. In 1977, Somalia invaded Ethiopia's Ogaden region. The Soviets and the Cubans poured weapons and around 16,000 Cubans into Ethiopia, tipping the war in favor of Ethiopia against Somalia. As a result of the war, both nations emerged weakened and decades of strife followed. Similar patterns unfolded in Mozambique, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, where the liberation movements had to fight not only against colonial regimes, but also against Cold War interferences. Mercenaries from South Africa and Europe fought for profit and in support of ideology, while Cuban soldiers, seen as liberators by some and occupiers by others, shaped the outcomes of wars in Angola and to a lesser extent in Namibia. While the Cold War raged, another war was being waged silently through economics. In the 1980s and early 1990s, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, prescribed a phenomenon known as the Structural Adjustment Programs, or SAPs. SAPs is yet another tragedy that Africa faced. Under SAPs, loans were given with strict conditions to countries in Africa. African governments were forced to cut public spending, public officials were retrenched, privatization of state enterprises done, removal of subsidies, cost sharing was introduced in schools and hospitals, among other many conditionalities. The results were devastating. Education and healthcare systems in states in Africa collapsed. Unemployment soared. Public service weakened, and food prices rose. Nations became trapped in cycles of debt, repaying more than they had borrowed. These policies, imposed in the name of reform, hollowed out states and deepened the notion of dependency. Even today, 3 decades later, states in Africa are still on the recovery from the enduring negative effects of these subs. Perhaps the most human cost of the Cold War in Africa was displacement from Angola to Mozambique, from Somalia to Sudan. Millions were forced to flee their homes. An example is Kenya's Kakuma and Dadaab refugee camps that became home to many escaping war and famine in the region. These were not isolated cases, they were the humanitarian legacy of proxy wars fought on African soil. The Cold War officially ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but its shadow remained. Civil wars did not vanish overnight. Puppet regimes lingered, often ruling through repression. Fragile democracies struggled to take root, and the economic scars of subs continue to limit Africa's growth. And so we return to a haunting question. What does sovereignty mean when it is shaped by coercion? Can a nation truly be free when its choices are dictated by debt, by military aid, or by the threat of regime change? These questions are best explained by Kwame Nkrumah using Ghana's example, which states, and I quote, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa." So we must ask ourselves, are we truly free when our economies remain shackled by old dependencies? When military coups still threaten democratic spaces? When foreign interests still dictate our trade, our votes, our futures? We are unchained, yes, but not fully free. The struggle now lives on in a new form. In the fight for economic sovereignty, political transparency, and cultural renewal. This next chapter of Africa's complex journey that we must not ignore. I unquote. The Cold War was never Africa's war. Yet Africa paid one of the highest prices in lives lost, in opportunities squandered, and institutions weakened. And yet, through it all, the spirit of the continent never broke. Africans fought not just for survival, but for dignity, justice, and sovereignty. As we close this episode, we leave you with a reflection. What would Africa look like today if it had been allowed to chart its own course, free from superpower manipulation and economic dependency? And how do we ensure that in future global conflicts, Africa is never again reduced to a pawn on someone else's chessboard? I thank you for tuning in to the series, The Perils Facing the African Continent. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and join the conversation in the comment section. Let us continue to learn from our history and envision a future where Africa is free, not just in name, but in reality. Thank you. God bless you, and see you during the next episode.